Part 4. The Maturation of Colonial Society, 1680-1730. Imagine yourself walking on the cobblestone streets in Boston in 1680. The clatter of horse hooves blends with the cries of street vendors, the smells of freshly baked bread from the bakery, and the distant chime of church bells. Large ships are anchored in the harbor, laden with timber, furs, and tobacco bound for Europe, while other ships bring back textiles, porcelain, and new ideas. The English colonies in North America are no longer fragile outposts easily wiped out by hunger or harsh winters. They have matured into vibrant communities with towns, schools, and even new conflicts. This was a period when the colonies began to forge their own identity, but it was also when the first cracks in the relationship with England and among social classes began to appear, foreshadowing a turbulent future. In New England, Boston had become a bustling center, with a growing population and wooden houses being replaced by stunning brick buildings. Imagine a Sunday morning when the entire community gathers in church, listening to the sermons of Puritan ministers who still held strong spiritual power. But the atmosphere here had changed. Generations born in America, no longer carrying memories of England, began to question the distant control of the kingdom. Schools like Harvard trained new leaders who not only knew the Bible but also read the works from John Locke and other Enlightenment thinkers. Ideas of individual rights and freedom began to subtly emerge, though still faint. Meanwhile, in Virginia, tobacco plantations has transformed the region into one of the wealthiest colonies. Imagine lush green fields where laborers from impoverished, indentured servants to African slaves worked tirelessly. Slavery, which was only a small part in the early days of Jamestown, now became the economic backbone of the South. Ships carrying shackled Africans arrived at ports with increasing frequency, bringing people deprived of their freedom and culture. Imagine a man brought from West Africa standing on the Virginia dock, his eyes empty but contained a fierce will to survive. These slaves were not just laborers, they brought with them music, stories, and the seeds of a culture that would shape America later. But Virginia's prosperity was not for everyone. Indentured servants, often poor young people from England, came with the promise of land but often received only years of arduous labor. Many died before completing their contracts, and those who survived often found themselves unable to compete with wealthy plantation owners. Discontent simmered within them, and in 1676 it erupted in Bacon's Rebellion. Imagine Nathaniel Bacon, an ambitious young settler, leading a crowd of disgruntled farmers and laborers, attacking both Native Americans and the colonial government. They burned Jamestown, declaring opposition to the injustice of the elite. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, and Bacon died of illness. But the events left a profound lesson. Inequality was dividing colonial society, and the people were ready to rise up. In the North, New England was also not immune to conflict. King Philip's War, 1675-1676, was one of the bloodiest wars in colonial history. The Wampanoag, under the leadership of Chief Metacom, called King Philip by the English, rose up against the encroachment of settlers on their land. Imagine burning villages, ambushes in deep forests, and fear engulfing both sides. This would devastate New England, destroying dozens of towns and killing thousands, including both settlers and Native Americans. When Metacom was killed, his head was severed and displaced as a trophy, a brutal symbol of English dominance. But this victory came at a high price. The indigenous people of New England lost much of their land and power, while the settlers realized that their expansion would always be accompanied by blood and fire. Meanwhile, new colonies continued to emerge. Pennsylvania, founded in 1681 by William Penn, was a unique experiment. Penn, a Quaker with a belief in peace and equality, dreamed of a colony where everyone could live in harmony regardless of religion. Imagine early Philadelphia, neatly planned streets, simple but cozy houses, and Quaker meetings where everyone had a voice. Pennsylvania became a destination for immigrants from all over Europe, Germany, Ireland, Scotland, bringing their cultures and languages. But even here, tensions with indigenous peoples like the Lenape tribe persisted as land continued to be taken. Trade was the driving force behind the colony's development. In Boston and New York, merchants grew wealthy by exporting timber, fish, and furs, while importing wine, tea, and luxury goods from Europe. Imagine a bustling harbor with shouting sailors, cargo being loaded onto ships, and illegally dressed merchants discussing prices. But trade also brought dependence on Great Britain. The colonies were bound by the Navigation Acts, forcing them to trade only with Britain or through British ships. Some merchants began to smuggle secretly, an early sign of dissatisfaction with distant control. Culture also began to flourish. The first printing presses appeared, publishing books, newspapers, and even poems, praising the new land. In New England, schools taught children to read the Bible, but also began to teach mathematics and literature. Women, though limited to domestic roles, began to make their mark by managing households and educating their children. Meanwhile, on southern plantations, enslaved Africans brought their dances, songs, and folktales, creating a unique hybrid culture, though constrained by shackles. By 1730, the English colonies had become an inseparable part of the empire. They produced raw materials, consumed British goods, and served as a springboard for the kingdom's ambitions. But within these communities, a new identity was forming. Those born in America, called Americans, no longer felt entirely British. They were proud of their land, but also began to resent the laws from London. At the same time, social injustices between planters and laborers, between settlers and indigenous peoples, between freedom and slavery were simmering, waiting to erupt. As dusk fell over the fields of Virginia or the streets of Boston, these colonies were not just spring spots on the map of the British Empire, they were communities of people with dreams, fears, and aspirations. They were building a new world, but also inadvertently laying a groundwork for conflicts that would shape the destiny of a nation yet to be born. This was a period when America began to discover who it was, but also when big questions about freedom, justice, and power began to echo, awaiting answers in the decades ahead.